I believe we are live. Um, Sorry for the
Cool.
primitive technology.
No worries.
So how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Trying to be better. So I will share the live stream on YouTube, on Twitter, and then we may really start around 8:05.
Cool.
Okay. Um, okay. Okay, I shared it. So could you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm Declan O'Gara. I'm a fresh PhD student at Edinburgh. I'm mainly interested in meta-ethics. So my current research is on companions and guilt argument, which is an argument within meta-ethics to do with error theory. And it's a defense of, well, what I try to do is a defense of the error theory against companions and guilt arguments. Previously, I've done other stuff, but all broadly meta ethics. So, my MA, I looked into kind of how we can fit together atheism and moral realism and whether there's a tension there. And essentially, the companions and guilt stuff has kind of come out of that because there was a bit of my MA thesis that was on that. So I've kind of moved away from the religious stuff right now, but it's probably something I'll look into again further down the line.
So your areas of interest shift from philosophy of religion stuff to metaethics in a more general way, in a more secular way, maybe.
Yes, I guess so. Yeah, so I'm still interested in philosophy of religion, and I would say so. My thesis in my MA was definitely more meta ethics than philosophy of religion. It was like philosophy of religion combined with meta ethics, I guess. Um, but for my PhD thesis, it made more sense to go with more general stuff, just for like publishing and stuff like that. And just the companions and guilt debate is like a very current thing, like it's happening kind of at the moment. There's papers being published every year, and it's something that I'm really interested in. So it makes sense to write a thesis about that if I want to try and publish.
Mm-hmm. So it's a fresh topic. How many years passed since the debate began?
So, so the error theory debate started with Mackey, which was in '77. I say started. There was stuff before that, but like he was the one that came with the argument with Queerness. In his book, he talks about companions and guilt, so he kind of conceived that would be a way to respond to the argument. But I would say the current debate really started with Cuneo's book, Terence Cuneo, in 2007.
I think.
Yeah. So that's like the big jumping off point. And then most stuff now is basically an extension of that. So people discussing the ideas in that book. And then it's quite a small group of meta-ethicists, so it's quite easy to trace it back to his book. But that's kind of when the debate really started. So pretty new, the meta-ethics terms.
2000s, I believe.
Yeah.
Not so early, yeah.
Yeah.
So our topic is today moral realism and the tensions between moral realism and atheism. So your position, I believe, is not so common among atheist philosophers. Usually they believe something like moral realism and atheism are compatible or there's no significant tension between them.
Yeah.
But as I understand um, the lay of the land, I think this impression that most atheist philosophers don't feel that don't think that there are any problems between or tensions between moral realism and atheism is due to most atheist philosophers interested in that specific debate being philosophers of religion.
Yeah.
So outside philosophy of religion, for example, philosophers of science, epistemologists, maybe, I think moral realism might not be that much common.
Yeah, that might be the case. I would say so. One thing that is going on is that like the Phil Papers survey is quite good for stuff like this because you can see just like what people's positions are. So in that survey, like the vast majority of philosophers are atheists. It's something like 70 or 80%, like a really high amount. Whereas like moral realism and kind of error theory, it's a bit more like even. So like there's slightly more moral realists, but then there's people that have other positions. So like it's much more up for debate. So I think what's happening is that because everyone's an atheist, it's just not something that they feel like they need to discuss. Like it's like a kind of a settled issue among philosophers. And also, I imagine, I'm not sure about this. I imagine a high percentage of like the ones that aren't atheists probably do philosophy of religion. So like most meta-ethicists probably aren't religious at all. And so it's just a thing that they feel like they ought not discuss or just don't need to. And there's quite a good paper by Anscombe. I think it was in 58. She was religious, and she wrote a paper where she basically said that, like, look, we're moving into a more secular period in philosophy, and there's all these meta-ethicists just carrying on without really addressing the shift from theism to a secular meta-ethics, and she thought that was a mistake. So she basically thought that there were quite big repercussions if you're going to move from a theistic meta-ethics into a secular one. And she thought that a lot of our current kind of moral worldview was shaped by theism. So she thought that it was really problematic. If we're going to get rid of the theism, we might need to get rid of the moral realism as well. Is essentially what she thought. And obviously, she was coming at that from a religious standpoint. I kind of agree with her in a lot of ways. Not necessarily. I'm not sure if like how much the stuff about like it being shaped by theism is true. That might be true, but there are other possible explanations like evolution. But certainly, I feel like it's a thing that should have been discussed more than it has been. And I think she captures it quite well in that essay. But that essay was like 70 years ago now, and there's not been much discussion since.
I believe we will touch about when we will talk about normativity, for example. I think Anscombe's point might not be that there is a problem or there is a tension between moral realism and atheism per se, but the problem is really the lawful stuff or the strong kind of normativity that seems to have a religious aroma, right?
Yeah.
So we will discuss that topic as well. But I think your diagnosis is quite right. It seems to be sociology of metaethics, right?
Yeah.
Or history of metaethics, maybe. Oh, so we will start with, I believe, moral realism. You think that moral realism and atheism are in tension. And before we can discuss what these tensions are, we should start with what moral realism is. But moral realism it too is a complex philosophical idea, and it has that big word realism in it.
Yeah.
So what is realism in general, and how does it relate to moral realism?
Yeah. So generally, when like there's a lot of kind of words that are then attached to realism, normally it just means that whatever the given kind of fact that is being discussed does really exist. So there's like epistemic realism and prudential realism. So they're about like whether epistemic facts exist. If you're an epistemic realist, you take epistemic facts to exist. If you're a prudential realist, you take prudential facts to exist. And it's the same in moral realism. I mean, moral realism is a bit more fleshed out than in other domains, just because this is something that meta-ethicists have been talking about a lot longer than epistemologists and kind of people that do well-being. I mean, in philosophy of maths, it's a bit more fleshed out, but a lot of the stuff that's going on in like epistemology right now is kind of meta-ethicists moving over to say that we should talk about the same issues. Specifically in moral realism, there's a few different claims that are attached to the theory, but most commonly it's cognitivism. So cognitivism is the claim that when we engage in moral discourse, we are trying to pick out some facts about the world. And then also it's the realist claim, which is that there are those facts. And so sometimes our moral claims are true. So sometimes they attach to those facts. And then there's other things that people disagree on. So other parts of moral realism, generally in the debates that I look at, they also hold that those moral facts are irreducible. Some people hold that they are reducible. So some people are naturalists, but that's not really something I engage with at all. Everyone in the Companions in Guilt debate pretty much holds that they're irreducible. So yeah, that's another thing that's attached to the definition.
So for example, in moral realism debate, the realism part might be, there might be some criteria for being a realist for a certain domain, like maybe mind independence, or maybe some people think that perspective independence, in a sense. It should be an independent fact of the matter. Like it should not depend on what we want, what we desire, what our attitudes are. So there's that kind of realism as well. Or maybe if you hold that knowability and truth are independent of each other, something might be real and yet unknowable, you might be a realist.
Yeah.
But that is a more general metaphysical thesis, I believe. Moral realism claims that these moral facts, whatever they are real. Maybe they are mind independent, or they are in the fabric of the world, as some might say.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people hold the mind independent stuff. The reason I don't normally attach that when I'm talking about it is just because Cuneo doesn't think that they have to be mind independent. In his book, he starts by outlining moral realism of a paradigmatic sort, and he doesn't include mind independence in that. And because often, like especially in my thesis, like the start of it is going to be on his argument, I'll just grant him that the mind independence isn't important because it's not going to be important for my response. But yeah, a lot of moral realists or people talking about moral realism have that as one of the parts.
Yeah. So mind independence, you might be even agnostic about mind independence stuff when you engage in that debate.
Yeah.
I do, for example, if you think that conceptualists are realists about mathematical objects, they don't think that it is mind independent. So realism in some domains at least does not require it. So there might be some kind of attitude independence, though, I believe, because that seems to be the more significant part of moral realism or realisms in general.
Yeah,
even and that creates some problems.
Yeah, there's also, so in meta-ethics, like quasi-realism, so Blackburn's quasi-realism, I don't think I'm not like really up to date on his realism, but I'm pretty sure he thinks that they're mind dependent. I think that is what his claim is. And obviously some people don't think that that's properly realist, but he thinks he's a moral realist. And then also quietism is similar. So there are some like theories within like the realist sphere that don't necessarily hold the mind independence part.
There's a lot room for maneuver for everyone in pretty much every philosophical debate.
Yeah, I kind of like not to do too much meta philosophy, I kind of think at this point, a lot of the broad labels aren't necessarily really helpful, especially in metaethics, just because there's so many theories in between that with like the only really like useful way of going about it is saying I'm talking about this specific theory, and then this is what argument I'm going to make out of it. Making broad claims about moral realism or anti-realism at this point is just not very helpful, which is part of like what I found in my MA thesis, because I tried to do that and say that moral realists like altogether can't be atheists, and like that just doesn't really work as an argument. But that's okay to do in an MA thesis, because you're supposed to make broad sweeping claims.
So we will discuss now the error theory. Error theory is forwarded by or depended by Mackey, but I think if you want to look at history, there are some error theoretic claims, but the name is usually associated with Mackey. So we now have some conception of moral realism, but the main opponent of moral realism is error theory. So I, error theorists, believe that realism is false. And what is it really? Or what is it that makes someone an error theorist about pretty much every other domain, right? Because you may be an error theorist about numbers or propositions or something like that. So what are error theories in general? And we may get back to moral realism and error theory about that.
Yes. So error theorists, they agree with realists on a certain part of their theories. They agree with cognitivism about a given domain. So they think that the speech acts in a given domain are trying to pick out some kind of facts, but they think that those speech acts are an error because those facts don't exist. So say if you're an epistemic error theorist, you think that epistemic discourse assumes that there are some kind of epistemic facts, but that it's an error because those facts don't exist in reality. And then the way that that's motivated is that it's claimed that those facts are queer in some way. So it's called the argument from queerness. How that queerness boils out, and just because that's not the way it's used now, it just means kind of weirdness. That's how Mackey used it. How that boils out is kind of different for different people. There's a few different ways where you can think that a kind of fact is queer. Often it's to do with like normativity. That's what I base on. So it's the idea that certain kinds of normativity are queer. So kind of the authority that normativity has is seen as to be quite strange. And just like the built-in kind of to be pursuedness is seems to be quite strange. So that's what the term Mackey uses in his chapter, although he's not very specific on what he thinks the queerness is. That's something that error theorists have built up more recently. So yeah, there's different ways that it can boil down to, but it's essentially that it's a really strange kind of fact if it were to exist. And then error theorists hold that since we shouldn't want to have those kind of strange facts in our worldview, we ought to just be error theorists about them, just hold that they don't exist. Mm-hmm. And there are other things that motivate an error theory that we might talk about later. So like debunking arguments and arguments from disagreement, those are slightly different. But yeah, generally it's the argument from queerness is like the big one.
So we talked about error theories in general. You are a cognitivist about a certain domain, like they are expressing facts. They might be true or false, but they're all false because the corresponding facts do not exist.
Yeah, so just they're not. Yeah. So this is sort of thing that people get mixed up on quite a lot. Yeah, they're not all false. They're neither true or false. There's no truth conditions. So that is like quite a weird distinction, but it's the claim that there's no truth conditions at all, rather than them being all false. Because if you were to claim that they'd all be false, you're still saying that there's some objective facts of the matter. So it's more that there's just no truth or falseness about them.
Oh, yeah, that might be We need to do some philosophy of language here. I think, like source and stuff, maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I think there are problems that I'm not like really big on philosophy of language. Like I've not done like tons of it. I know there's like the law of the excluded middle, but I remember I was talking to like a linguist friend of mine, and he was like, "Oh, we don't even worry about that anymore." So maybe it's something I need to think about at some point, but it's definitely not a thing that anyone brings up in the error theory debate at large. Like it's not a thing that moral realists are throwing at error theorists. So it's a pretty like small issue, I
yeah.
think.
So we are not going to uh, uh, going very deep about the arguments for error theory or arguments for moral realism, except one exception. So we see what is error theory. We might go into some arguments in favor of it, right? Because you think that an atheist should be an error theorist. Um, there's some irony in that. I think an atheist should be
Yeah.
an error theorist. So why should we think that?
Yeah, so I think I mean
Straightens. Yeah.
yeah, I mean my view has definitely softened. It was more I think I ended up coming more away from it thinking there was a tension rather than thinking that they definitely should be error theorists. I think essentially what I thought, and this is what I argued in the paper, in the thesis, is with atheism, it seems like there's an attachment to like a physicalist worldview in a way that there isn't with theism. And when you take on certain like strange beliefs, they seem to not fit into the worldview in a way that just isn't a problem for a theist. So the way that I framed it in the thesis was I talked about a thing called ontological danglers.
Yeah.
So I borrowed that from a guy called
Philosophy of mind.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's,
Fernand Faidul, I believe.
yeah, Feigl and then Smart co-ops it in a paper of his. They call it nomenological danglers, but I just used ontological because it makes more sense in the meta-ethical debate. Um, and I essentially argued that if you're an atheist, certain views seem really strange. So it doesn't necessarily need to be moral realism. You can take a view, like say if there's an atheist and they're always a naturalist or always a physicalist about everything, except for they believe in ghosts.
Yeah.
That would be really weird because you'd be like, but that doesn't really fit into all of your other claims. Like you've got this worldview where you're physicalist normally, so generally you only believe in the things that are posited by science, but you've got this weird belief about ghosts, which doesn't seem to fit into everything. And I tried to make a similar thing about moral realism. So if you take those moral facts to be queer, if an atheist believes in those and nothing else, like nothing else that goes against physicalism, it seems like there's a tension there because it's like an ontological dangler within their worldview. And then I contrasted that with theism. So with theists, their worldview is already committed to some quite strange properties. So they already believe that God exists. They already believe that all matter comes from God, or a lot of them do. They already believe in things like angels and heaven. Like there's just a lot of metaphysically weird things that they take into their view. So taking on another one just isn't a problem because it's not a dangler because
Yeah.
their whole worldview is like quite metaphysically strange. So it's just not a problem for them in the same way that the atheists have.
Yeah.
So that was kind of what motivated the argument. And it came from basically a lot of apologists. So, like in America, they will make claims about how religion is the only way to capture a realist meta ethics, but they will then use that to motivate an argument for religious belief. So
Yeah.
I essentially tried to flip the argument to say that, well, this is just an argument for a lack of belief in moral realism. The main thing that I concentrated on the first chapter of my MA thesis is William Lane Craig's argument to this effect. So he had a debate with Paul Kurtz on this. The debate is quite weird because they both somewhat misunderstand the question, or at least Paul Kurtz thinks it's a debate about whether atheists can be good people, when it's really a debate about
disaster. I saw that.
yeah, it's really a mess. But Lane Craig at least gets his argument across because he knows that it's a meta-ethical question. But he essentially says you can either be a theist or a secular humanist, and he uses that term because that's what Paul Craig is. Paul Kurtz is. But he essentially just means moral realist, or you can be a moral nihilist. And then he says that, look, theism captures all these things that we want for moral realism. So it captures the authority, it explains where it comes from, it answers all these questions. Secular humanism, as he puts it, doesn't answer any of these questions. And we don't want to be moral nihilists, therefore we should be theists. That's the argument that he makes. The problems with that are that, one, he's just not outlining enough meta-ethical views, which, I mean, there was a problem with my own thesis, but certainly, and I don't know how much he knows about meta-ethics, but in that debate specifically, it doesn't come across like he knows a lot about meta-ethics. And that's not his fault, because that's not what he does, but it definitely weakens his argument. And then also, I thought the issue was that he just dismisses nihilism really quickly, which is maybe just because, again, he probably isn't that involved in meta-ethics, so he doesn't know about error theory. He doesn't know about all the anti-realist views. But at least his motivation is similar to mine. He still sees this tension with atheism and realism. So I try to employ the reasoning that apologists are using, but just end up in a different conclusion.
Just a quick question about your way of framing the queerness argument or weirdness argument, because it seems to me that you might employ some kind of that argument in a sense that we should be eliminating materialists about consciousness, for example, right? Do you think it works as well for consciousness, or there's some relevant difference?
To be honest, I've done very little philosophy of mind, so I wouldn't want to make any sweeping claims about that. I mean, I have looked at how the argument works in other areas. So like philosophy of maths, for example, people try to employ similar reasoning, but then in philosophy of maths, there are different things that come into play, which make it harder to like employ it in those areas. I think it does seem to work quite like at least somewhat well in like epistemology and in like discourse on well-being. So there are error theorists in those areas. But yeah, consciousness isn't one that I've really looked into, so I'm not too sure, honestly. I mean, I think generally I'm like a physicalist when it comes to consciousness, but again, I'm not up to date enough in that debate to really make any claims about it.
Fair enough. So we are going to talk about how why an atheist should be an error theorist. Like weirdness is one aspect of it. Do you think other arguments for error theory, like disagreement or others, evolutionary debunking arguments, do they have any merit, or the main argument is queerness or weirdness?
Yeah, so I think, so up to now, I've really concentrated on error theory, but recently I've been reading some Joyce, and he has a more holistic view, like error theory, so he tries to look at all the ways you can motivate it. And I think that I'm quite interested in having that kind of a view. I've never really been massively convinced by the argument from disagreement, just because I feel like there are other ways of explaining why the disagreement is happening, and there's disagreements in a lot of fields in a way that like makes me think that we'd end up like a lot of people don't want to be epistemic error theorists, and there is definitely an argument from disagreement within epistemology about a lot of things. And so yeah, I think if I relied too heavily on the argument from disagreement, it would commit me to a lot of kind of weird things and error theories in areas that I just don't want to be an error theorist necessarily. But the evolutionary debunking arguments I quite like. I think that the way I would frame it is I don't like a lot of like evolutionary psychology stuff where it like makes a claim, like a possible claim about evolution, and then takes that as fact. But what I quite like is if you make a claim like, oh, there are other possible explanations for why we're cognitivists. One of them is evolution. Another is like an Anscomian argument where you say that maybe it came from theism. That's the kind of thing that Joyce seems to do. And I'm quite sympathetic to that because I think probably is a good idea to try and explain why we're cognitivists. I think the error theorists probably ought to do that because we are all like, or at least we claim that we are all making moral claims and that they are trying to pick out realist moral facts. And so if you're an error theorist, you ought to explain why that's the case. And I think the evolution, at least, is a plausible explanation for that.
Okay, so we saw which arguments are used for defending error theory, and your research, current research, focuses on companions in guilt arguments, as you said before.
Yeah.
So what are these arguments? Because they aim to respond to error theory. What are these companions in guilt arguments? Which companions there are, for example?
Yeah, so what a companions in guilt argument generally tries to do is to say, here, there's this other domain where there is a kind of fact that shares some problematic features with moral facts, but we don't want to be error theorists about those kind of facts because there's it's either really undesirable or there are just major problems with being an error theorist about that kind of fact. Generally, it's talked about epistemic facts. That's the one that the vast majority of the literature is on. That's what Cuneo talks about. That is what Chris Cowie and Richard Rowland and Daz talk about, and they're like some of the main players in the companions in guilt literature. But more recently, Guy Fletcher, who's one of my supervisors, he wrote a paper about prudential companions in guilt. So he works on well-being, and he basically said that we could look at prudential facts or prudential reasons. They seem quite close to moral facts, but you probably don't want to be a prudential error theorist. I'll kind of explain the two theories a bit more in detail, but those are like the two main ones. There are other ones that people talk about, but I think my current opinion is that those just are unlikely to work very well. So there's papers on like aesthetic companions in guilt. There's papers on mathematical companions in guilt. So Justin Clark-Doan has a paper on that. But I think the issue with a lot of those companions is that if you're an error theorist and you think we can get away with the epistemic companions of guilt argument, the prudential companions of guilt argument, you think you can dismiss those. At that point, like if you have to be like an aesthetic error theorist, that's just not that big of a problem. Like they're way less worrying. And to be an epistemic error theorist, it's really quite like a big thing to take into your worldview. Whereas if you already believe that there are no moral facts, having to believe there's no aesthetic facts is just not a big problem. So I think that's why I think that these two specifically are the ones that where like the real meat is, just because those are the ones that can cause actual big problems, in my view.
Okay, so maybe we should first talk about a little bit more prudential companions in guilt arguments, because that is what your research focuses on. But later, I think we should also somehow talk about epistemic arguments as well.
So it might actually be easier to do it the other way around, because so Guy's paper is actually a response to criticisms of the epistemic companions in guilt argument. So essentially, he presents it as an improvement. So it might be easier to talk about the epistemic ones first, the problems of those, and then talk about Guy's paper. And also, I am doing both. So essentially, the way my thesis is going to be structured, or like right now, is I'm going to talk about the epistemic companions and guilt argument, see how we can respond to it, and then move on to the prudential companions and guilt argument, and then try and bring my own response to it because it's not really been discussed too much yet in the literature. That's a much more new argument. So yeah, if you're happy to, I can explain the epistemic one first.
Okay, fair enough.
So the companions and guilt argument generally has two premises. So it has a parity premise and then an existence premise. So the parity premise is that if the moral error theory is true, so too is the epistemic error theory, because essentially if there is this feature of moral facts X, whatever that is, that feature is shared by epistemic facts. And if you want to reject moral facts for having that feature, you also need to reject epistemic facts for having that feature. Generally, that's boiled down to just either categorical normativity or irreducible normativity. So it's taken that both of them have that. And that if you're going to reject one for having that, you need to reject the other. Cuneo has like a whole chapter devoted to where he thinks the parities lie between epistemic facts and moral facts. But generally, he thinks, though, in terms of like authority, it seems like the normativity within moral facts has authority, so it guides our action. But so too does the normativity in the epistemic domain. So it guides our action. If you are presented with some evidence, you have to form some kind of belief. It seems like you can criticize people for poor poor belief formation, because it seems like there's a lot of normativity at play there. And yeah, so essentially there's this analogy between the two. That's the parity premise. The existence premise is just that the epistemic error theory is false. So the way that that's motivated, specifically by Cuneo, is that the epistemic error theory, which is the claim that there are no beliefs or that there are no epistemic facts, is very undesirable because it seems like it's self-defeating, or Cuneo thinks it's self-defeating, because in order to uphold the epistemic error theory, you have to claim that the epistemic error theory is true, although you can't believe in the epistemic error theory because there are no beliefs. So he thinks that it's self-defeating in that way because you have to uphold a theory that you can't have any beliefs in. And also, it's just incredibly undesirable to have a theory which claims that there's no beliefs. Like, it seems quite a big theory to take on for the error theorists.
That seems really strange because when I think about epistemic error theories, they seem to be not denying, for example, mental states like beliefs and so on, but they seem to claim that there are no true norms of belief formation, true norms of discussion and so on. So it seems to be the moral error theory seems not moral. Epistemic error theory does not seem to be committed to the claim that there are no beliefs. They are just mental states, right?
Yeah, so I suppose it's in terms of like how the beliefs are formed. So maybe how you put it is a bit more kind of succinct. It's to do with like how the normativity is at play and how those beliefs are formed. The way that Cuneo talks about it, so his argument, the self-defeat argument, people disagree with that. So people think that we can still get by with quite a lot of like epistemology, even if you are an error theorist about specifically the normativity. So you can still be concerned with truth. You can still have philosophical discussion. It's just not that the objectivity goes out. But people think that it's not as big of an issue as Cuneo seems to think. But that's not the main line of response to Cuneo. The main line of response is essentially just saying that there is a disanalogy between moral facts and epistemic facts, in that epistemic facts seem like they're reducible in a way that moral facts aren't. So epistemic facts seem to reduce to like things like evidential support relations. So it seems like because they're trying to pick out a fact in the world, which is truth, you can naturalize them in like a Quinean kind of way. in a way that it doesn't seem like you can do with moral facts. Like, obviously, some people think that you can reduce moral facts, but everyone in this debate thinks that you can't. So that doesn't really come up. But yeah, a lot of people like, this is what Cowie argues, and he's one of the most prominent defenders of the error theory against the companions in guilt argument. He argues that they're reducible. And if they're reducible, that just gets rid of the issue because there's no parity anymore. You don't need to be an epistemic error theorist if they're reducible because they're metaphysically unproblematic at that point. The claim that some piece of evidence gives me more reason to believe in some proposition is fine. Like, that's not a worry because there's some piece of truth that is being picked out there, and it's reducible to this evidential support relation, which is taken to be metaphysically unproblematic. So that's like one of the main lines of attack and defense, I guess, for the error theorists. And that's just undermining the parity premise, basically.
Okay, so what about the prudential arguments? How they connect with epistemic companions and guilt argument?
Yeah, so the epistemic argument is discussed at the start of Guy's paper. So he starts by saying, this is the argument, this is how it's been discussed. Then he presents Cowie's objection, which is about the evidential support relations. And he basically says, assuming this is true, and assuming we can naturalize epistemology in this way, we need a new companion. And he presents prudential reasons as this companion. So prudential reasons are just kind of basically claims about our well-being. So you have a prudential reason to do something if it is good for your well-being. So I have a prudential reason to take a job if it's going to pay me better and it's in a similar location and it'll improve my life. Or I have a prudential reason to eat healthily or whatever. We have lots of prudential reasons. And he says that in terms of the parity premise, prudential reasons is pretty close to epistemic reasons in that it seems like there is a parity between the two. So prudential reasons are normative, they're clearly action guiding, because if you have a prudential reason to do something, then you have a normative reason to do that. And he says also that it's superior to the epistemic companions and guilt argument because he doesn't think that there's any way to reduce prudential reasons. And then in terms of how problematic it is, he says that the prudential error theory is similarly problematic to the epistemic error theory. There's not the self-defeat argument, so it's less problematic in that way, but like I say, not everyone really buys into the self-defeat argument. And at minimum, saying that there are no prudential reasons is quite worrying because you'd have to make a claim like nothing is ever good or bad for anyone, which is quite a strong claim and isn't necessarily something that a lot of people would want to commit themselves to. So yeah, he basically says that it acts in a similar way to the epistemic companions of guilt argument, but has this advantage in that epistemic reasons don't seem reducible in the same way. So in terms of how you argue against that, which is what my thesis will be ultimately about, or a lot of it will be about, I think I'll go about it two ways, which is how you do it with the epistemic companions of guilt argument. You start by saying maybe there's a disanalogy, and then you can also say maybe the epistemic error theory just isn't as big of a problem as it's been made out to be. That's what people like Olson and Strumer do. And that's probably what I'll do in my thesis. I think I'm going to present it as like a two-part solution. So like maybe we can get rid of the analogy, or maybe it's okay to be an error theorist in this debate. And I think I'll do the same thing with the prudential companions and guilt argument. So the way that you try and get rid of the analogy is by saying basically that the desire fulfillment theory of well-being is true, which is that we only have a prudential reason to do something if it links up with one of our desires, so it fulfills one of our desires. The way that that dissolves or defeats the parity is that if it's linked to our desires, then that's just metaphysically unproblematic and it reduces. And so that the parity breaks down. And then in terms of the error theory, I would have to make a claim something along the lines of the prudential error theory just not being as problematic as Guy makes out. I've not thought as much about that, so I'm not really sure if that's a thing that I will argue. But at least it seems somewhat plausible. Because I used to think that the epistemic error theory was completely implausible. So I didn't even bother going down that line. But I've since read some stuff by Olson and Strumer that makes me think that maybe it is plausible. And so I imagine that similar reasoning can be employed in the prudential case, but that's something that I'll be thinking about quite far down the line.
Okay, so about the prudential desire fulfillment theory of prudential reasons or well-being, I think the same kind of strangeness somehow remains in even that theory, because I have a desire to do X, I should do X, right? It seems to be not that closely related. In a way, you might somehow reject the result, even though you agree with I desire X, right? But you might even say that I desire X, but okay, why should I do that? A kind of open question argument, maybe.
Yeah, so I suppose an important distinction in this is that there's a distinction between categorical reasons and hypothetical reasons. So a categorical reason is I have a reason to do this thing regardless of my desires, regardless of my mental state, regardless of kind of the rules in the society that I live in. It's just a reason that is produced purely by virtue of there being some kind of fact. So that is how moral reasons seem to work. So if you have a moral reason to do something, you have that reason regardless of what you think about it, regardless of what the pressures are in your wider society. It's just there is this moral fact, and therefore you ought to act in some certain way. With prudential facts, like Guy doesn't think this, but this is what I would have to argue. I would argue that they're hypothetical in that you only have a reason so long as you have this desire to do that thing. As soon as that desire breaks down or you stop having that desire, you no longer have a reason to do that thing. So in the case you describe, it might be that as soon as you're questioning it, you cease to have the desire and that you no longer have the reason. So the reason is dependent in a way that isn't with moral facts. And that's how I'd have to argue that there's the disanalogy. So it is the distinction between hypothetical and categorical reasons.
We talked about prudential companions and guilt arguments and epistemic arguments, and we talked about also how might we avoid prudential arguments. You seem to involve desire fulfillment theories of well-being, and since these theories give us only hypothetical reasons and not categorical reasons, which seems to be required for moral reasons, the analogy between prudential reasons and prudential normativity and moral normativity or epistemic normativity breaks down. That is your project, which you are a first year student, so how long it takes to do a PhD in England, I think?
So you get accepted, and those that are funded get 3 years of funding. But generally, basically, everyone takes 4 years. Some people finish in 3.5, but essentially everyone that I know has taken 4. Some people take 5, but I would say that generally it's 4. So normally the first year is just spent kind of trying to really work out what your project is going to be. So I came into this year and I applied with my master's thesis just because that's what I'd produced. So that was the easiest thing to propose. But then as soon as you get here, they're essentially okay, what do you actually want to research? Maybe you can research a specific area that was discussed in this. So the first bit is spent working out what you really want to concentrate on. And then you've got to write a first chapter. So that's what I'm working on right now. So pretty much at the moment, I'm only working on the epistemic companions and guilt argument because that'll be my first and hopefully second chapter. The way I plan on doing it is doing the first chapter on the parity premise, seeing if there's like a reductive or naturalist account of epistemic reasons that can be employed. And then hopefully the second chapter will be on whether the epistemic error theory is potentially less problematic than Cudio makes out. So that'll be on people like Strumer and Olson and the epistemic existence premise, essentially. And then later on, I'll move on to the prudential companions and guilt argument.
So we now understand error theory and how we might defend it and how we might respond to it, and also how we might respond to the response.
Yeah.
So now we need to talk about theism and moral realism. You think that theism is better equipped for moral realism to make sense? Anyway, why?
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying, like in my MA thesis, I didn't really engage with whether theists can like truly fit a moral realist worldview into their worldview, like because there are definitely problems with it. I mainly wanted to just see whether atheists like can fit it in and just argue that they can't. But I do think that minimally theists can just avoid the queerness worries for what I discussed earlier. I mean, the way this was originally motivated is when I first did metaethics, I was an atheist by that point, and I always just thought like, oh, this would be really easy if I was a theist, or certainly a lot easier because I don't have to worry about a lot of the things that I'm worrying about now. The theist can at least say that like, oh, well, here's the source for all these objective moral facts, and they don't really need to worry about how weird those facts are. But certainly, there's still massive worries. If you're like a divine command theorist, you like Euthyphro is quite a big issue. So it's not like they can just take on moral realism and just be really happy about it and not have to defend it at all. But I think at least minimally, there's some issues that they just avoid. And it might be that like my view is now less so that there's a tension between atheism and moral realism. It might be that just some things that are solved if you're a theist that necessarily aren't solved if you don't have that belief in God. And I think I worry about this, and that this is why, like, if I was ever going to try and do a paper on this, which I don't know if I will, but I was ever going to try and go at this again, is making it clear that I'm not trying to do what the apologists are doing. So making it clear that I'm really not trying to motivate a religious belief, because that is just what generally is this kind of argument does. It's just more that I think that the religious belief helps, but it doesn't get rid of the fact that I think that there are loads of problems with like theism as a theory. So like in my mind, theistic realism isn't an option because of the theism part. But certainly, I think if you're a theist, there are some things that are easier in terms of metaethics.
So the main advantage seems to be that theism is a strange worldview, and moral facts also are strange. And strangeness seems to be more fitting for a theistic worldview.
Yeah, and I don't want to, like, strangeness there isn't like an evaluative claim, more just in terms of the metaphysics, it's different from physicalism. So, like, it's just not physicalist, basically.
It's not strange for them, in a way.
Yeah.
So, I think there are some additional advantages of theistic realist metaethics. I discussed them before in our semi-academic magazine. I am one of the founders of Öncül Analitik Felsefe Dergisi. And the first small paper I wrote there was about Craig's moral argument. And I wanted to be as charitable as possible to theistic metaethics and listed some advantages. Like one of them was the strangeness part. Even though they don't have any robust theory of metaethics or robust explanation of normativity, they might simply claim that, look, it just fits together better, and they might just leave it there. The first part was that, and also the second part was explaining the necessity of moral facts. Because if you're a naturalist and you believe that the universe is contingent as a whole, and you also believe that moral facts exist and they are necessary, how these theses go together seems to be not so clear. And maybe you might claim that there are some hypothetical, like there are some necessarily true hypotheticals about morality, like if such and such happens, it is wrong. If such and such happens, it is right, or so on, or it is good, it is bad, etc. So that kind of necessity might be helping for naturalists. But the problem is that if you believe in some metaphysical thesis like truth maker theory, there are no truth makers if there is no universe, and if also there's no abstract objects that are different from the universe. If you believe in some kind of truth maker theory, that kind of hypothetical necessities will be problematic for the atheist. One motivation was that because if God is a necessary being, at least in his mind, these hypotheticals might have some truth makers. But when I looked into theistic metaethical theories, I didn't see that they are clearly better than atheistic alternatives. Like theism it is easier to be a theistic moral realist, but the theories themselves are not so easy to defend.
I think maybe like it might be, and this is probably would have been a better way of framing it, and I would frame it like this if I was going to do it now, is I would basically only want to claim that theists can deal with queerness worries better than atheists can, rather than saying that atheistic realism is really worse off than theistic realism. But like, it's just because it was when I was doing my MA, it's just the kind of strong claims that they basically want you to make. Any MA thesis is kind of like that. It's always like, oh, I'm going to solve the problem of consciousness. Or I'm going to prove that God exists. Like, that's just kind of the thing that you do in an MA thesis. And I mean, if you read the thesis, it's like much less conclusive than like the title makes it sound. But yeah, I think now if I was going to do it, I definitely just want to frame it in terms of how theistic realism and atheistic realism would deal with queerness worries. Because there just definitely are issues with theistic realism. And again, the major issue is the fact that they've got to prove that God exists. So like, it's like there are problems with it. And like, I mean, I wouldn't be able to be sold on it unless they prove that God exists. So there's a lot of work to get to that point. And then they've got to solve all the problems of the actual theory. So like, it's not like a slam dunk for them, even if they can avoid queerness worries. Because in getting to that point, I'm granting them an awful lot. But yeah, I think one thing that Craig talks about is that he thinks that they can deal with like the authoritative nature of moral facts a bit better. So because they've got this lawmaker who also is the one that provides like the punishment, he thinks that there's like a clearer kind of basis for the authoritative nature of moral facts and the fact that they always guide our action because we've got this like punishment at the end. I don't really buy into that, but that's like another thing that he talks about specifically in like the Kurtz debate. But again, some of that is that it's like basically non-philosophers doing meta ethics. That's sometimes what like I find like really annoying about like apologists, because I always think that like it'd be really interesting, and like I'm sure people have done this. Like there are philosophers of religion like Peter Van Inwagen, but like people like Lane Craig his arguments could be a lot better if he was just like a bit more of a philosopher. And that's not really a massive criticism of him because that's not what his job is. And he's had a very successful career. But like if he wanted to make the kind of argument that he makes, if he did a bit more meta ethics, he could probably make a quite good argument. But yeah, there's just a lot of weaknesses that aren't even necessarily about the view that he's putting forward, and they're just more about his like maybe lack of understanding, I guess.
I think about Craig's attitude to that debate. I think he seems to be two persons at a time. Like he is sometimes a better philosopher, and
Yeah,
he is sometimes a better apologist. And
yeah,
these two sometimes clash between each other because in a debate, it is not that. It is not wise to be overly charitable to your opponent
yeah.
in a debate setting, right? So in that case, he seems to just bash them with arguments and not so much worry about, how we can steelman your arguments and so on.
Yeah,
But
and
in a more philosophical setting, he seems to be capable of doing that at least.
yeah, I think so. So yeah, mainly just talking about in that debate. I think he is quite like generally he's quite good philosopher in terms of like apologists. And I mean also in that debate, because Curtis misunderstood the debate, it just made it quite easy for him. So he doesn't really need to really boil down his arguments because at least he's making an argument for the debate topic. So like he could have done whatever and it would have been fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. I find that debate really interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's just very strange.
It seems like a philosopher is debating a freshman philosophy undergraduate.
Yeah, which is what I mean. And I'm not massively familiar with Paul Curtis, but I think he is like he is an actual philosopher.
Philosopher, yeah.
So like he's just misunderstood it. But also, it's not even just him because like so they've got they did a symposium after the debate. So they published the debate and then they had a load of philosophers write articles about it. And also Kurtz and Craig write an article, like basically formalize their arguments that they made in the debate and respond to some of the articles. And even someone in the symposium, and I don't know what her name was, I've forgotten about it. I've given a presentation on it before, but she basically just wrote an article about how she was really annoyed about the fact that Craig was saying that atheists couldn't be moral. And like he would never make that kind of claim because it'd just be really strange. And he's smarter than that. He's not just going to make a ridiculous claim about how atheists like actually act. But like people just misunderstood it.
He even says that in debates. Look, I'm not saying this, and
Yeah,
people still misunderstand.
yeah. He literally like verbatim says it because Kurtz has his whole first argument about how like, oh, you're saying that atheists can't be moral, and then immediately he's like, of course I'm not saying that because that's insane. And then still people read it and misunderstand him. And I guess it's just because people like they see like an evangelical guy, they think they just want to be uncharitable, I guess, because like they think that they're doing somewhat malicious things. But like I think as a philosopher, it's much better practice to be as charitable as possible. And I guess that maybe just when you're arguing with apologists, people don't do that.
Yeah. So before closing, I want to discuss. So I think I understood your position better in that discussion because I thought that overall you are claiming that overall atheistic nihilism is better than atheistic realism. You are not claiming that, at least not strongly claiming that right now. So in that case, what do you think that what are some best alternatives non-theists have in case of morality? Because moral realism is not the only view that wants to maintain the objectivity part of the moral discourse. Because we have the versions of constructivism, or we have even versions of naturalism, moral naturalism, and especially both of these approaches seem to minimize the strange part of moral discourse, especially metaphysically. First, do you think that moral objectivity requires moral realism? Do you have any justification for that claim? Because some people, for example, claim that without realism, and they have some version of truth maker theory as well, for example, without realism, you don't have any moral truths. Therefore, realism is required for objectivity. Do you think such worries are warranted?
Yeah, I think so. So I think that there's some theories, so like quasi-realism and quietism, they claim to have some kind of objectivity, but I think often that objectivity is certainly less strong than like a non-reductive realist can have. I think so. Naturalists can claim to have objectivity, but there's a lot of other problems with naturalism. So there's like twin Earth worries, but twin Earth, I mean, has been like people are less convinced by that now. But recently, like very recently, Matty Declan had a book called Choosing Normative Concepts, and he presents a new, like, similar twin Earth worry to naturalists, and I'm very convinced by his position, which is why I don't really think that naturalist views are very attractive. But yeah, I think that generally I would say that you need realism for objectivity. And I think potentially it might be better to go down an anti-realist view if you didn't want to be an error theorist and hold some kind of expressivist view. But I think those are also not amazing. I guess generally it's hard because I just think people should be error theorists. So I have problems with all the other views. I think one like theory that I really like and I'm quite sympathetic towards kind of pairs with error theory. So I don't know how familiar you are with Joyce, but he has a theory called moral fictionalism, which I quite like. There are issues with it, but I think that at least that is quite a good way for an error theorist to have a more holistic worldview where they can frame how we can act and just get on with our life and not have to see error theory as this like really worrying, like nihilistic worldview, like someone like Craig frames it as.
Or it is not a practical dead end in a way,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I mean, this kind of brings us back to companions and guilt arguments. So for people that don't know what moral fictionalism is, it's basically the claim that once you've decided that error theory is true, you've gotten to the point where you think that moral discourse is an error, you then need to make a further decision about, okay, well, what do we do now then? Obviously, some people might think that, oh, we can just do whatever we want and be nihilists. Joyce thinks that that isn't a very attractive view. Joyce thinks that what we ought to do actually is create like a fictionalist discourse, which is basically we just continue to act like we are doing now. We live and engage in moral discourse as if there are moral facts. And then when we're in like the philosophy classroom, we can be error theorists. The way that he motivates that is by employing prudential reasons. So he thinks that it's just prudentially beneficial to not have to uproot your life and go around being an error theorist and just like you see someone getting injured and you don't care about it. Like that's just a lot of work. So it's just prudentially beneficial to carry on as normal. Now, the reason that the prudential companions and guilt argument is that a big issue for him is that if someone like Joyce has to be a prudential error theorist, he can no longer motivate his moral fictionalism. And I think that's something that I might talk about at some point. But generally, I'm quite attracted by that view.
Interesting, because I think your way of framing Joyce's position seem to be, for example, you are sympathetic to desire fulfillment theories of well-being, for example, and that kind of theory seems to work better with contractualist theories of morality, for example, because that kind of theories theory usually don't claim that there are absolutely binding moral norms. We all have some interests, desires, and we all want to have we all want to be able to pursue our life projects, interests, wants, and so on. And there are some, for example, societal arrangements that seems to be better than that, better for that purpose. But it is still not that absolutely binding kind of normativity, but there is some objectivity there too, right? At least in a prudential way, that seemed to give you an objective morality in a way. But it is not the traditional, it is a revisionistic account of morality.
Yeah,
Right?
so I think with my limited understanding of contractualism, I think that the difference is that contractualism is non-cognitivist. So I think they're claiming that is what morality is already like, right? So I think because I'm a cognitivist, I just wouldn't be attracted to that position. There are other kinds. So fictionalism, there is a cognitivist version and a non-cognitivist version. So hermeneutic fictionalists think that we're already like engaging in a fictionalist discourse. So they think that when we're engaging in moral discourse, if you really ask someone what they were doing, they would basically say that they were being a fictionalist. And then someone like Joyce, they're a revolutionary fictionalist. So he thinks that that isn't what discourse is like now. That's just what we should do going forward. And because I'm a cognitivist, so I don't really think if you ask someone what they were doing, they would claim that we're being fictionalists. I think that that is what we should do going forward once we've recognized these problems with our discourse. And I mean, that's one of the positions that I'm not like massively secure on. I think there's a thing that philosophers often do where they say that, oh, this is what a normal person engaging in some discourse would say. And really, we don't know. But yeah, at least for myself, I think that cognitivism is generally true. And given that, I would have to lean more towards fictionalism. And I think fictionalism probably does work with the desire fulfillment theory of well-being generally. Because if you think that prudential reasons are based on desires and you have a desire which creates a prudential reason to just carry on living in society as you already normally do, you could then be a fictionalist. And I think that's probably the kind of view that Joyce would have to take on if he discussed the prudential companions and guilt argument. It's a very new theory, so I don't think he's said anything about it yet, or at least I've not seen any papers from him on that.
Maybe it might be one of your future projects, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so because I'm quite interested in fictionalism. I'm thinking now, and obviously because I'm a first year, like it's very hard to say like where my PhD project will go. Yeah. Maybe I'll end up not even arguing about companions and guilt arguments. People change quite a lot from their first year, but right now I am envisioning maybe like a fifth chapter on fictionalism and maybe how it's affected by companions and guilt arguments. Because I do think at least there's like a plausible tension between fictionalism and prudential error theory. So it seems like there is a connection. And also just generally, meta-ethicists employ prudential reasons quite a lot because they're just taken as like a given. So Cowie in his book talks about prudential reasons all the time. But because they've not been presented with this argument yet, because the guy, it was only like 2018, I think, that a guy published this. It's just not a thing that they've had to be worried about before. And maybe you can revise a lot of the theories to not discuss them, but at least minimally, it's a thing that people talk about quite a lot without really thinking about it. And I mean, that's like a general issue, I think, in like just with well-being and prudential discourse, because especially in the well-being discourse, they don't really make a distinction between meta-prudential discourse and first-order prudential discourse or normative prudential discourse, just because that's the thing we do in meta-ethics and we're trying to move it into other fields. So a lot of the stuff that you read in there, they'll be talking as if it's like just first order, but really they're making meta-prudential claims as well. And I think because there's not that distinction, people aren't as worried about it when they talk about prudential reasons. But that's one of like guys that's his main thing really. He has a book about that where he's trying to kind of show that we need to talk about meta prudential stuff. It's called Dear Prudence. Should probably plug it. Very good book. But yeah, he's essentially saying that we need to talk about like meta prudential stuff. And I think if people start talking about that, it'll at least make some waves because people talk about them like they're not problematic at all.
Yeah. So in the case of metaprudential stuff, do you think that is it something like this? If I'm wrong, the metaprudential norm, for example, is that if you desire X, you should do X.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it that kind of norm or something?
Yes. So I think this because the lines are quite blurred. So the desire fulfillment theory of well-being is both first order and second order. Yeah. So it's a bit like how utilitarianism is kind of both. So you can be a utilitarian in that you think that we should act in accordance with utilitarianism, or you could be like a meta-ethical utilitarian, which isn't a thing that people espouse a lot now, but where you think that moral facts literally are those facts that associate with producing the most pleasure or the most value. Yeah. So it's pretty similar with desire fulfillment theory, but that's purely just because it's not really a thing that is discussed in that sphere yet as much. And again, like I said before, it's just because meta-ethicists are moving into these spheres and saying like, oh, these questions that we talk about in meta-ethics, maybe you should talk about them here. And that's also why, if you notice, like there's been loads of papers now that talk about normativity in other areas, and that's kind of why.
Yeah. Wow. It was a very heavy conversation for me, and especially not being able to smoke during the live stream takes its toll. Thank you so much for being here. I have lots to think about. If you have any last words for our audience, which is not that many, by the way, because in a Turkish live stream, we have like 100, 150 viewers per live stream at a time. But in an English live stream, it seems to be around 30 to 5, and people do not know English very much in Turkey, but we want to change that in a sense. So if you have any last words for me or the audience, go for it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It was really fun to discuss it. You seem very knowledgeable about a lot of areas, which is nice.
Thanks so.
And yeah, if you want to discuss it again at some point, let me know.
Goodbye then.
Okay, goodbye.